The ceiling of the shelter cracked open like an eggshell, and I watched the sky fall in through the gap. My name is Vektal, and I was not a soldier. I was a records keeper, a small official whose only job was to file reports nobody read. That night, I was hiding under a metal desk while the swarm tore through the upper levels of my city, and I was certain I would not see another sunrise. The swarm did not look like an army. It looked like smoke that had learned to hate. It moved as one thing and 1,000 things at once, spreading through streets and buildings, taking everything, leaving nothing behind but silence. We had no name for it that meant anything anymore. We just called it the Hollow, because that was what it left behind. 3 weeks earlier, it had been a distant warning on a science station orbiting a dead moon. 2 weeks earlier, it had been a fleet of our best ships, gone in a single night. 1 week earlier, it had reached the outer edge of my world, and our leaders had stopped answering questions on the public channels. By the night I am telling you about, it was in my city, and I was done pretending we had a plan. I was not supposed to be near the communications core. I was supposed to be in the lower shelters with the other clerks, waiting for an evacuation order that was never going to come in time. But my friend Selnari worked in that core, and when the building above her section collapsed, I ran toward it instead of away, because some part of me could not accept losing one more person quietly. I found her alive, pinned by a fallen support beam, her communication panel still humming with power even as dust rained down around it. She was not thinking about herself. She was staring at the panel with wide, frightened eyes. "There is a channel," she said, her voice shaking. "An old one, sealed generations ago. Nobody uses it. Nobody is allowed to use it." I asked her what she meant, even as I pulled at the beam with hands that did not have the strength to move it. "The quarantine channel," she said. "The one that leads toward the species we do not speak of, the ones our ancestors sealed away." I had heard whispers of them my whole life, the way children hear ghost stories, a species so violent, so unpredictable, that an entire alliance of civilizations had agreed, generations ago, to cut them off from the rest of the galaxy and never speak to them again. Not because they had done something first, but because of what they were capable of doing if provoked. The stories never explained exactly what had happened. They only warned us never to find out. The building groaned above us. Dust fell in sheets. Somewhere below, I heard the sound the hollow made when it fed, a sound I still cannot describe without my hands shaking. "Selnari, we are going to die here," I said. "Everyone is going to die here." She looked at the panel, then at me, then back at the panel. Her fingers moved before her mind caught up to them, entering the sequence that had been locked away since before either of us was born. I did not stop her. I do not know if I could have, and I do not know if I would have wanted to. "This is a distress call," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "Open frequency, any receiver, please." The message she sent was short. I remember every word of it, because I helped her choose them in the last seconds before the beam above us gave way completely and I had to drag her free by force. "We are being erased. We do not know how to stop it. If anyone can hear this, we are asking for help. We have nothing left to offer in return except our honesty. We are afraid, and we do not know what else to do." We did not wait for a reply. There was no time. I pulled Selnari free as the ceiling came down where we had been standing a moment before, and we ran through corridors filled with smoke and falling debris, past neighbors and strangers doing the same, all of us moving toward the lower shelters like water finding the lowest point in a broken landscape. I did not think about the message again for hours. Survival does not leave much room for memory. I remember carrying an elderly stranger on my back for 2 streets before someone else took the weight from me. I remember the moment the hollow reached the plaza near the shelter entrance, and how the ground itself seemed to lose color where it passed. I remember believing, with complete certainty, that my world was ending and that nothing was coming to save it. It was near dawn when the attack finally slowed enough for the automated defense grid to hold a line at the outer district, that someone found me again. It was Selnari, her arm bandaged, her eyes red from smoke and from crying, holding a data slate with shaking hands. "Vectal," she said. Something answered. I did not understand her at first. I thought she meant a rescue ship from a neighboring system, one of the small fleets that sometimes helped smaller worlds in the outer ring. But she shook her head and turned the slate toward me, and I saw a signal trace, unlike anything I had studied in all my years filing reports about interstellar communication protocol. It was not words. It was not even close to any language format our systems recognized. It was a location. Coordinates, repeated 3 times, followed by a short burst of encrypted structure our systems could not fully translate, except for one fragment that came through clean, almost as if it had been left simple on purpose so that any species, anywhere, could understand it. "We are coming." I felt something cold settle into my chest, heavier than fear, heavier than the exhaustion pulling at every part of my body. I looked at the coordinates again, and I recognized the sector immediately, because everyone who had ever studied the old warnings recognized it. It was the sector marked off on every star chart with a single warning symbol, and no explanation beyond 3 words repeated across 1,000 years of careful silence. "Do not provoke." I looked at Selnari, and she looked at me, and neither of us said what we were both thinking, because saying it out loud would have made it real. We had sent a plea into the dark, out of desperation, out of nothing left to lose, and the only thing that had answered, out of every star and every ship and every ally we thought we had in the galaxy, was the one place every civilization had agreed, long before we were born, never to call. Behind us, in the ruined streets above the shelter, the hollow was already beginning to move again, patient and endless, waiting for the sun to rise on whatever was left of my world. I did not know, in that moment, whether we had just called for a rescue or for something far harder to name. I only knew that the silence after that message felt different from every silence before it. It felt like the moment right before a door opens, when you can hear footsteps on the other side and you have no way of knowing what is about to walk through. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. We sat huddled in the lower shelter, listening to the distant sound of the hollow testing the defense grid, and we waited for an answer that none of us were sure we wanted anymore. 3 days passed before the sky changed. 3 days passed before the sky changed, and in those 3 days I learned more about fear than I had in my entire life before them. The elders called an emergency session in the deepest shelter beneath the capital, the one built for exactly this kind of catastrophe and never once used until now. I was not supposed to be there. Clerks did not sit in on council meetings, but Selnari had been asked to explain the signal she had received, and she refused to go without me, so I found myself standing at the back of a stone chamber filled with the oldest and most powerful members of our government, all of them arguing about a message none of them wanted to believe was real. "It is a trick," said one elder, a thin, sharp-voiced woman named Threll. "The hollow does not speak, it does not send signals, but something else might, something that wants us weak and confused while it finishes what the hollow started." "There is no evidence of a second threat," Selnari said, and I could hear the exhaustion under her careful, formal tone. The signal traced to the quarantine sector, nowhere else. It followed the exact frequency structure recorded in the old treaty archives, structure that has not been active in generations. "That is precisely the problem," said another elder, an old, heavy-set man whose name I never learned. "That treaty exists because our ancestors decided, together with every other civilization in this part of the galaxy, that the species behind it should never be allowed contact with the rest of us again. Do you understand what it means that they answered within hours of a single distress call, when it takes our own allied fleets days to organize a response? Nobody had a good answer for that. I certainly did not. I only had the memory of the words on that slate, simple and immediate. We are coming, not we will consider your request. Not we require further information before deciding whether to respond. Just those 3 words, sent back almost as fast as the plea had gone out. I found the old records later that night, in the same archive room where Selnari worked, searching for anything that might explain what we were about to face. Most of it was redacted, blacked out by decisions made centuries before either of us existed, but some fragments remained, buried in footnotes and cross-references nobody had bothered to fully erase. The species was called humanity. Their homeworld was called Earth, a small blue and green world in an unremarkable system, orbiting an unremarkable star. According to the records, they had not been discovered by the wider galaxy so much as they had discovered it themselves, reaching outward faster than any species their size should have been able to manage, driven by something the old reports called restlessness, as if that single word could explain everything that followed. There had been a conflict. The records never explained what started it, only that it ended with a treaty so severe that every signing civilization agreed never to make contact with Earth again, and never to explain fully to their own people why. I found one line, buried deep in a footnote written by an official whose name had been removed, that stayed with me long after I closed the file. They do not fight the way we fight. They do not stop the way we stop. When their world is threatened, they do not calculate the cost of victory. They simply decide to win, and then they do. I did not sleep again that night either. I kept thinking about the hollow spreading across our districts, patient and unstoppable, and I kept thinking about a species so dangerous that an entire alliance of worlds had agreed to erase them from memory rather than risk provoking them again. I did not know which fear was larger anymore, the monster we already knew, or the one we had just invited in. On the second day, the elders reached a decision, though decision might be too generous a word for what was really just surrender to circumstances beyond their control. The hollow had breached 2 more districts overnight. Our defense grid, built to withstand conventional attacks from conventional enemies, was failing against something that did not fight by any rules we understood. We had no other offers of help. No neighboring system had answered our call, either because they could not, or because they did not believe a species as small as ours was worth the risk. Only the one place we had been warned our entire lives never to contact had answered, and it had answered before we even finished sending the message in full. "We will receive them," Threll said, finally, her voice flat with resignation rather than agreement. "We do not have the luxury of choice." I was assigned, along with Selnari, to the delegation that would meet the arriving ships at the northern landing field, chosen not because of any skill either of us possessed, but because we were the ones who had made the call in the first place, and the elders seemed to believe that meant we should be the ones to answer for it. I remember standing in the assignment hall, listening to my name read aloud, and feeling my legs go weak beneath me. "You did not do anything wrong," Selnari told me afterward, though I was not sure I believed her, and I was not sure she believed herself either. "You saved us a chance. That is all any of us can ask of ourselves." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that reaching out into the dark, even toward the one place we had been told never to look, was better than doing nothing while our world was erased. But sitting in the transport that carried us north toward the landing field, watching the smoke still rising from the districts the hollow had already claimed, I could not shake the feeling that we had traded one unknown horror for another, and that we would not understand which one was worse until it was far too late to choose differently. The landing field itself had once been used for agricultural transports, wide and flat and mostly empty, chosen because it was one of the few open spaces large enough to accommodate an unknown arrival without putting the capital directly at risk. Soldiers from our own defense force lined the perimeter, though I do not know what they expected their weapons to accomplish against ships that could cross the distance between stars faster than our own fleets could manage in a lifetime. We waited for 6 hours in the cold morning air before the sky itself seemed to bend, just slightly, at a single point above the horizon. I remember the sound before I remember the sight, a low pressure that pushed against my ears like the moment before a storm breaks, and then the light, a controlled, steady descent unlike anything our own technology could produce. The first ship to land was small compared to what I expected, sleek and dark, settling onto the field with a quiet precision that felt almost more unsettling than a dramatic arrival would have. No dramatic flames, no roaring engines, nothing but a soft hum and a gentle touch against the ground, as if the ship weighed nothing at all despite its obvious mass. For a long moment, nothing happened. The field was silent except for the wind and the distant, ever-present hum of the hollow's presence, somewhere beyond the horizon, patient as always, waiting for its moment. Then the ship opened. I do not know exactly what I expected to walk out of that hatch. Some part of me, shaped by generations of vague warnings and half-erased records, had imagined something monstrous, something with too many limbs or too many eyes, something built entirely for violence and nothing else. What actually stepped out was, for one confusing moment, almost disappointing in its ordinariness. A single figure walked down the extended ramp, upright, 2 arms, 2 legs, a face not so different in basic shape from my own, though the proportions and coloring were unfamiliar. She wore a simple dark uniform, without excessive decoration, and she moved with an easy, unhurried confidence that felt strange given everything I had heard about her species. She stopped at the base of the ramp and looked across the field at our delegation, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that perhaps the old warnings had been exaggerated after all, that perhaps we had nothing to fear from a species that looked so much like us. Then she raised one hand, not in greeting exactly, more like a signal, and behind her, the rest of the ship's cargo bay began to open. What came out of that bay was not ordinary at all. I heard Selnari's breath catch beside me. I felt my own legs try to take a step backward before some deeper instinct told me that running would accomplish nothing against whatever was emerging into the pale morning light. Shapes moved down secondary ramps on either side of the main one, low and fast, and built with a kind of purposeful, terrible grace that I had never seen in any creature, natural or artificial, in my entire life. They were not soldiers in any uniform I recognized. They were something else entirely, something that moved on 4 limbs as easily as the woman moved on 2, something with eyes that tracked every point of our formation at once, something whose very presence made the hair along my arms rise in ancient, wordless alarm. The woman at the base of the ramp watched our reaction with an expression I could not fully read, something between patience and understanding, as if she had seen this exact fear on other faces, on other worlds, more times than she could count. "My name is Laura Bennett," she said, and her translator device rendered the words into our language with only a slight, mechanical delay. "You sent a call for help. We heard it. We came as fast as we could." I wanted to ask her what, exactly, had come with her. I wanted to ask why a plea for rescue had been answered with creatures that looked less like saviors and more like the nightmares our ancestors had warned us about in the same breath as they warned us about humanity itself. Instead, all I could manage was a single, trembling question, spoken before I had fully decided to speak it at all. "What are they?" Laura Bennett looked past me, toward the smoke still rising on the horizon, where the hollow continued its slow, patient consumption of everything we had ever built, and when she looked back at me, there was something in her eyes that I would spend the rest of my life trying to fully understand. "They're the reason your world is still going to be here tomorrow," she said. "Now tell me everything you know about what we're facing." I told Laura Bennett everything I knew, which was not much more than what any frightened clerk could have offered, but she listened as though every word mattered, writing nothing down, simply absorbing it with a stillness that felt strange coming from someone whose ship had just unloaded creatures built for hunting. While I spoke, the low, 4-legged shape spread out across the landing field in a pattern that seemed random at first, and then, as I watched longer, revealed itself as something deliberate. They were forming a perimeter, spacing themselves at even intervals, facing outward toward the horizon where the hollow's presence pressed against the edges of our world like a slow, endless tide. Selnari stood close beside me, close enough that I could feel her shaking, though whether from fear or exhaustion or some combination of both, I could not say. She kept her eyes on the nearest of the creatures, a lean, silver-furred shape with eyes the color of pale ice, and I understood exactly what she was feeling, because I felt it too. It looked at us the way a hunter looks at something it has already decided is not prey, a kind of dismissive awareness that was somehow more unsettling than open hostility would have been. "They will not harm you," Laura Bennett said, noticing where our attention had gone. "They are trained. They know the difference between a threat and a civilian. You are not on their list." "What is on their list?" I asked, before I could stop myself. She turned to look at the smoke on the horizon, and for the first time since she had stepped off the ramp, something tightened in her expression, something that looked almost like old familiar grief. "Everything that made you send that call," she said. More ships arrived over the following hours, each one larger than the last, until the landing field that had once handled slow agricultural transports was crowded with dark, quiet vessels and the shapes that emerged from them. I saw creatures built like great cats, broad-shouldered and low to the ground, with claws that could tear through reinforced metal as easily as we tore through fabric. I saw shapes built for the water, sleek and heavy, moved onto specially designed transport frames that would carry them toward the flooded lower districts, where the hollow had already begun consuming our coastal settlements. I saw things with wings, circling high above the field, watching the horizon with a patience that felt ancient, despite what I would later learn about how recently they had actually been created. Laura Bennett explained it to me plainly, without any of the ceremony I expected from a species so feared across the galaxy. "Earth is a violent place," she said, as we walked along the edge of the field, her attention split between our conversation and the steady stream of activity around her. "It always has been. Every living thing on our world spent its entire history learning how to survive against something else that wanted to eat it, or outcompete it, or simply take its place. We did not invent violence. We inherited it, the same as every other creature that ever lived there." "Then why bring it here?" I asked. "We asked for help, not for more danger." She stopped walking and looked at me directly, and I felt, for the first time, the full weight of whatever experience had shaped the calm, steady person standing in front of me. "When your call came in, it did not ask for diplomats," she said. "It did not ask for negotiators, or engineers, or peacekeepers. It said your world was being erased, and it asked for anyone who could stop that from happening. We looked at what erased entire settlements in a matter of days, something that does not negotiate, does not retreat, does not respond to anything except overwhelming force, and we asked ourselves what we had, on our own world, that was built exactly for that kind of fight." She gestured toward the perimeter, toward the silver-furred shapes, and the great armored cats, and the circling wings above. "Every one of those was born from something that already knew how to survive against impossible odds," she said. "We did not build monsters to frighten you. We built protectors out of the only blueprint we had that was strong enough for the job. Your galaxy asked for saviors. Earth only had this to give, so we made this into saviors instead." I did not fully understand what she meant, not then, standing on that field with the sound of distant destruction still rolling across the horizon. I would come to understand it fully only a few hours later, when the hollow finally reached the outer edge of the landing field, and I saw exactly what those words meant in practice. It came the way it always came, not as a single visible enemy but as a wave of dissolving color, streets and structures losing their shape and substance as it passed, leaving nothing behind but a flat, gray absence where a city used to be. Our own defense grid opened fire the moment it crossed the outer sensors, the same weapons that had failed to slow it in every previous encounter, energy bursts that seemed to simply vanish into the leading edge of the swarm without leaving any visible mark. I expected panic. I expected the human forces to react with the same desperate, scattered defense our own soldiers had shown in every previous battle. Instead, what I witnessed was something closer to a held breath released all at once, controlled and total. Laura Bennett raised one hand, the same gesture she had used when she first stepped off the ramp, and the entire perimeter moved as a single organism. The silver-furred shapes broke from their positions first, faster than anything I had ever seen move, spreading out along the leading edge of the hollow's advance, in a coordinated pattern that reminded me, in some strange way, of the pack-hunting behaviors described in old survival texts from before our civilization built its first city. They did not attack the swarm directly. They circled it, forcing its spread into a narrower channel, herding something that had never in its entire existence been herded by anything. The great armored cats came next, moving in short, powerful bursts, closing distances that should have taken them minutes in the space of seconds. Where the hollow's leading edge tried to spread around the narrowing channel, the cats met it directly, and for the first time in 3 weeks of destruction, I watched the swarm actually slow down. Above us, the winged shapes dove in coordinated waves, striking at points along the swarm's mass that the ground forces had already weakened, and I began to understand, watching it unfold, that this was not chaos. This was a hunt, planned and executed with the same precision our own military had spent years trying and failing to achieve. I asked Laura Bennett, my voice barely above a whisper, how they had learned to fight something they had never encountered before. "We did not need to have encountered it before," she said, her eyes fixed on the battle unfolding across the field. "We needed to understand what it was doing and then respond to that. This thing spreads by finding the path of least resistance and consuming everything along it. So we did not give it easy paths. We gave it narrow ones, controlled ones, ones where every direction it could move led it directly into something built to stop it." The fighting continued for hours, the swarm testing every gap in the human formation with the same patient persistence it had shown against our own defenses, and every time, finding nothing but another wave of coordinated resistance waiting to meet it. I watched creatures I had been afraid of only hours before throw themselves directly into the path of something that had erased entire districts without slowing down, and I watched them hold their ground, again and again, until the swarm's advance along that section of the horizon finally began to break apart instead of spread. It was near sunset when Daniel Cross found me at the edge of the field, a tall, quiet man in the same dark uniform as Laura Bennett, though his had the scuffed, worn look of someone who had spent far more time in direct combat than diplomatic meetings. He carried a small device that I would later learn was a portable medical scanner, and he used it to check on a group of our own wounded soldiers who had been pulled back from the earlier failed defense line. "You are the one who sent the call," he said. Not quite a question. I admitted that I was, bracing myself for whatever judgment might follow. Instead, he simply nodded, his attention still mostly on the soldier he was treating, a young woman named Mira, who had been badly injured in the fighting before the human forces arrived. "Good," he said. "Because if you hadn't, none of this would be here to help her." I looked past him, toward the field where the silver-furred hunters were regrouping after another wave of fighting, their coats marked with the strange, dark residue the hollow left behind, wherever it touched something and failed to fully consume it. They did not look triumphant. They did not look like the monsters from our old stories, gleeful in violence for its own sake. They looked, more than anything, tired, the way any living thing looks after giving everything it has to protect something it was never required to care about in the first place. "They saved your soldier's life today," Daniel Cross said, following my gaze. "They'll save more tomorrow, if the fighting keeps up the way it's been going. That's what they were made for, not to frighten you, not to conquer you, just to stand in the gap when nothing else could." I thought about the old warnings then, the ones passed down through generations, the ones that spoke of humanity as a threat too dangerous to ever contact again. I looked at the exhausted, silver-furred shape resting near the edge of the field, its ice-colored eyes half closed, its powerful frame marked by a fight it had not chosen but had thrown itself into completely, and I found myself unable to reconcile the stories with what I was actually witnessing. "Why does the rest of the galaxy fear you so much?" I asked, before I could think better of the question. Daniel Cross was quiet for a long moment, finishing his work on Mira's injury before he finally answered, his voice carrying none of the anger I half expected, and instead something closer to old, settled sadness. Because we don't calculate the cost before we decide to help, he said. Because when something threatens what we care about, we don't stop to measure whether the fight is worth it. We just fight, all the way to the end, and most of the galaxy learned a long time ago that they'd rather not be near us when that happens. He looked out at the horizon, at the retreating edge of the hollow, pushed back for the first time in 3 weeks by something willing to meet it with the same complete, unwavering commitment it had always used to consume everything else. "Your world got lucky," he said quietly. "This time, that commitment is pointed at the thing trying to erase you, instead of at you." I did not sleep again that night, but for the first time since the hollow had reached my city, the fear keeping me awake was not the same fear I had carried before. It had changed into something more complicated, something made of gratitude and unease in equal measure, and I lay awake trying to understand what kind of world could raise creatures built entirely for war, and somehow, still, teach them exactly when and why to use that strength in defense of strangers who had never done anything to earn it, except ask. The battle for the capital continued for 6 more days, and in that time, I stopped thinking of the human forces as strangers and started thinking of them as something closer to neighbors, though that word still does not fully capture what grew between us in those long, exhausting days. I was assigned to remain with the delegation as a liaison, mostly because I was one of the few people who had spent enough time near the human forces to understand their methods without flinching every time one of the silver-furred hunters passed close by. Selnari worked alongside the communication teams, translating requests between our surviving defense grid operators and the human command structure, and together we found ourselves at the center of something neither of us had ever trained for, something closer to friendship, built entirely out of shared crisis. Grace Miller led the coordination effort from a mobile command post set up at the edge of the landing field, a woman whose calm never seemed to break no matter how close the fighting came to our position. She had a way of speaking that made even the worst news feel manageable, not because she softened it, but because she always followed it immediately with a plan. "The swarm is adapting," she told me on the 3rd day, pointing to a display showing the Hollow's movement patterns over the previous 72 hours. "It's learning to avoid the narrow channels we've been forcing it into. That means we need to change our approach before it finds a way around us completely." I asked her how a species with no visible intelligence, no communication, nothing resembling a mind that our scientists had ever been able to detect, could learn and adapt at all. "Everything that survives learns," she said simply, "even if it doesn't think the way we think. It doesn't need a brain to notice which paths get it killed and which ones don't. We just need to make sure every path still gets it killed." That night, I watched the human forces reorganize their entire strategy in the space of a few hours, something that would have taken our own command structure days of meetings and approvals to accomplish. The winged shapes shifted their patrol patterns to cover the gaps the swarm had begun probing. The great armored cats moved to reinforce sections of the perimeter where the silver-furred hunters had grown thin from repeated engagement. New shapes arrived from later transports, things I had not seen before. Low and heavily built, moving with a slow, deliberate strength that seemed designed less for speed and more for holding ground no matter what pressed against it. "They're called Badgers," Ethan Brooks told me, when he caught me staring at one of them during a brief lull in the fighting. He was younger than most of the other soldiers I had met, with an easy smile that seemed strange given everything happening around us, though I came to understand it was simply how he managed the weight of it all. Back home, they're small, stubborn. Nothing stops them once they decide to dig in somewhere. Turns out that stubbornness scales up pretty well. I asked him whether it bothered him, fighting alongside creatures built so directly from violence, when his own people back on Earth had spent so much of their history trying to move past exactly that kind of instinct. He considered the question longer than I expected before answering. "I used to think so," he said. "When I first signed up for this kind of work, I thought we were just finding new ways to be what we've always been. But then you see what these creatures actually do out here. They don't fight because they want to. They fight because something needs protecting, and they're what we had ready to send. There's a difference between violence for its own sake and strength used because nothing gentler would have worked in time. I thought about that difference often over the following days, watching the silver-furred hunters return again and again to the front lines despite visible exhaustion, watching the winged shapes fly patrol after patrol until their formations grew ragged with fatigue, watching the great cats hold ground against waves of the swarm that would have overwhelmed anything our own defenses had ever produced. None of them fought with anger. None of them fought with cruelty. They fought the way a levee holds back a flood, simply and completely, because the alternative was allowing everything behind them to be lost. On the 5th day, the fighting reached a turning point that I did not fully understand until much later, when Grace Miller explained it to me during one of the rare quiet moments between engagements. The Hollow had begun concentrating its full remaining strength against a single section of the perimeter, the section closest to what remained of the capital's central archive, the last significant structure in the city that had not yet fallen. I watched from the command post as the swarm's leading edge grew denser and darker than I had seen it in any previous engagement, and I understood, without needing anyone to explain it, that this was not another probe. This was everything the Hollow had left, thrown at a single point in a final, desperate attempt to break through before its own strength ran out entirely. "It's out of options," Grace Miller said, watching the same display I was watching, her voice carrying the first real note of tension I had heard from her in 6 days. "Everywhere else, we've closed the gaps. This is the only path it has left. What do we do?" I asked. She looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something in her expression that reminded me of the same fear I had felt on the first night, hiding under a metal desk while my city collapsed around me. Even the people who had come to save us were not immune to the terror of what might still be lost. "We hold," she said, "everything we have, right there, right now. There's no second plan if this doesn't work." I watched what followed from the command post, unable to look away even as every instinct told me to close my eyes against it. The silver-furred hunters formed the first line, spread thin but unbroken, meeting the concentrated edge of the swarm head-on for the first time in the entire engagement. No herding, no narrow channels, just direct, complete resistance against everything the Hollow had left to throw at us. Behind them, the great armored cats held a second line, catching everything that broke through the first, and behind them, the winged shapes dove continuously, striking at the swarm's mass from above in a rhythm that never seemed to slow no matter how exhausted they must have been after 5 days of continuous fighting. I saw Laura Bennett and Daniel Cross both move to the front line personally during that final push, not standing back to direct the battle from safety, but moving among the creatures they had brought with them, coordinating each wave of resistance with a precision that came only from complete, practiced trust in every living thing fighting beside them. The battle lasted less than an hour, though it felt, standing at the command post and watching every second of it, like it stretched across the entire remaining span of my life. I watched the swarm's leading edge press against the human line again and again, each wave slightly weaker than the one before it, until finally, in a moment I almost missed because I had stopped believing it would actually come, the pressure simply stopped. The Hollow, for the first time in 3 weeks, was retreating. Not slowly, not gradually the way it had pulled back from the narrow channels in earlier engagements. It broke apart entirely, the dense, dark mass losing whatever cohesion had held it together, scattering into fragments that dissolved against the horizon like smoke finally caught by a wind strong enough to disperse it completely. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced since the Hollow first reached my city. It was not the silence of destruction, the flat, empty quiet that followed everywhere the swarm had passed. It was the silence of held breath released, of exhausted bodies finally allowed to stop, of a threat that had seemed endless finally, impossibly, coming to an end. I found Laura Bennett near the front line an hour later, sitting on the ground beside the silver-furred hunter that had first stepped off the ramp beside her 6 days earlier, one hand resting on its flank as it rested, both of them marked by exhaustion in a way that made them look, for the first time since their arrival, less like monsters and more like survivors, exactly the same as the rest of us. "Is it over?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer and simply needed to hear it spoken aloud to fully believe it. She looked up at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something close to relief in her expression, tempered by an exhaustion so complete it seemed to reach all the way down to whatever kept a person moving through 6 days of continuous, desperate fighting. "It's over," she said. "Your world is still here." I sat down beside her without asking permission, too tired and too overwhelmed to remember whatever formal protocol might have applied to a moment like this, and for a long time neither of us said anything else. We simply sat together in the quiet, watching the sun rise over a city that had, against every expectation I carried into that call for help, survived to see it. 2 weeks after the retreat of the Hollow, I stood again in the stone chamber beneath the Capitol, though this time I was not standing at the back of the room waiting to be dismissed. I had been asked, formally, to address the council directly, and I understood, walking toward the center of that chamber, that whatever I said in the next few minutes would shape how my entire world remembered what had happened, and how it treated the strangers who had saved it. Threll was still on the council, though her sharp voice had lost some of its certainty since the last time I had heard her speak. She watched me with an expression I could not fully read as I took my place at the center of the chamber, Selnari standing just behind me for support, though this part of the work was mine alone to do. "You called them here," Threll said, without preamble, as was her way. "Tell us plainly, what have you brought into our world?" I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, because it deserved more than a quick, easy response. I thought about the silver-furred hunters resting exhausted after 6 days of continuous fighting. I thought about Grace Miller's calm voice, delivering terrible news, followed always by a plan. I thought about Daniel Cross treating a wounded soldier with the same careful attention he gave to every living thing under his protection, human or otherwise. I thought about Laura Bennett sitting in the dirt beside a creature the old records had taught us to fear, both of them simply too tired to do anything but rest together after giving everything they had for a world that was not their own. "I did not bring saviors," I said finally, "and I did not bring monsters, though I understand why the old records called them that. I brought exactly what we asked for, when we asked for help without knowing what shape that help would need to take. We asked a violent galaxy, in a moment of complete desperation, for anyone willing to stand between us and something that wanted to erase us entirely. Only one answer came back, and it came back fast, and it came back honest about what it actually was." "And what is that?" Threll asked. "A species that never stopped being what its own world made it," I said. "Earth is not a gentle place. It never has been. Every living thing there learned to survive against something else that wanted to take its place, the same way the Hollow wanted to take ours. Humanity did not overcome that history. They built on top of it. When our call reached them, they did not send diplomats or negotiators, because that is not what our message asked for. They sent exactly what we needed, built from the only blueprint strong enough for a fight like the one we were losing." I paused, gathering the rest of what I needed to say, aware that the next part would matter more than anything I had said so far. "The old treaty called them a threat too dangerous to contact," I said. "I do not think that was wrong. I think it was incomplete. They are dangerous, exactly as dangerous as every record warned. But danger and cruelty are not the same thing, and I watched them prove that difference every single day they fought for us, at a cost to themselves that none of us ever asked them to pay." Threll was quiet for a long moment, and around the chamber, I saw other council members exchange glances that carried more uncertainty than judgment. It was Selnari who finally broke the silence, stepping forward to stand beside me. "I sent the call," she said. "Not Vectol. I made that choice, in a moment when I believed we had nothing left to lose. I would make it again, knowing everything I know now. Our world is still here, because a species the rest of the galaxy was too afraid to ask for help, decided to answer honestly, instead of walking away." The council debated long after we were dismissed from the chamber, and I do not know every detail of what was ultimately decided, because that decision belonged to people with far more authority than a records clerk who had simply refused to hide when a friend needed help. What I do know is that within a month, formal contact channels were reopened between our world and Earth, not out of gratitude alone, though there was plenty of that, but out of a slow, careful recognition that the old warnings had been built on incomplete understanding, the kind that grows easily in the space where real communication should have been instead. I spent the following months working directly with the human delegation that remained on our world to help rebuild what the Hollow had destroyed, and in that time, I came to understand humanity far better than any old record, redacted or otherwise, could ever have taught me. I learned that Grace Miller had lost family members to conflicts on her own world before she ever left it, and that her calm under pressure was not the absence of fear, but something built carefully on top of it, the same way our own defense grid had been built on top of ground that had already been broken before. I learned that Ethan Brooks kept a small, worn photograph of his family from Earth in every uniform he wore, and that he wrote to them faithfully despite the months-long delay before any reply could reach him across the distance between our systems. I learned that Daniel Cross had once been a healer on Earth before circumstances there required something else from him, and that the gentleness I had first mistaken for simple professionalism ran far deeper than any uniform could fully contain. And I learned, slowly and carefully, exactly why the rest of the galaxy had chosen to seal humanity away rather than risk what happened when their full, uncalculated commitment turned against something instead of for it. There was a war, Laura Bennett told me one evening, months after the fighting had ended, when the two of us sat together on the edge of the rebuilt landing field, watching the same silver-furred hunter that had rested exhausted beside her the day the Hollow finally broke, now simply resting because it wanted to, its coat catching the last light of a sunset over a world it had helped save. Before the treaty, before any of the old warnings your ancestors wrote down, Earth was attacked, the same way your world was attacked, by something that believed we were too small and too disorganized to fight back effectively. What happened? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer, built from everything I had learned in the months since her arrival. We fought back, she said simply, completely, the same way we fought for you. And when it was over, the rest of the galaxy realized that whatever line existed between a species that fights to survive and a species that becomes something dangerous to everyone around it, we had crossed it without ever meaning to. They did not seal us away because we started something. They sealed us away because they were afraid of what we were capable of finishing, once we decided a fight was worth finishing completely. I sat with that for a long time, watching the sunset fade into the same deep, star-filled sky that had once felt only like a source of ancient warnings, and now felt like something closer to a map of unexpected allies. "Do you regret it?" I asked, answering our call, knowing what it might mean for how the rest of the galaxy sees you. She shook her head, and there was no hesitation in the gesture at all. Every world that seals itself away from something it fears eventually forgets why the fear existed in the first place, she said. We didn't answer your call to prove anything to the galaxy. We answered it because a message came through the dark, from people we had never met, asking for help in the plainest, most honest words anyone could have chosen. We are being erased. We do not know how to stop it. That is not a message you calculate a response to. That is a message you simply answer. I think about that conversation often, even now, long after the rebuilding was finished, long after the formal treaties between our worlds were signed, and the old quarantine channel was finally, officially retired from the archives that had kept it sealed for so many generations. I think about it especially when I meet representatives from other worlds, other civilizations still living under the shadow of the same old warnings that once shaped everything I believed about humanity before I met a single one of them in person. I tell them what I am telling you now, because I believe, more than almost anything else I have learned in my life, that the old fear and the old warnings deserve to be replaced with something closer to the truth. Humanity is not gentle. I do not believe they ever claimed to be, and I would not trust them if they tried to convince me otherwise. They come from a world that shaped them through struggle, the same way every living thing that has ever survived long enough to matter was shaped by whatever tried to stop it from surviving in the first place. When they decide something is worth protecting, they do not calculate the cost before committing to it completely, and that complete commitment is exactly what makes them so feared across a galaxy built mostly on careful, measured diplomacy and calculated risk. But I have also seen what that same complete commitment looks like when it is pointed towards saving something instead of destroying it, and I do not believe I will ever fully forget the sight of exhausted, powerful creatures resting quietly beside the people who brought them, both of them simply relieved that a world they had never seen before was still standing at the end of a fight they never had to enter in the first place. If you are reading or hearing this, and your own world ever faces something it cannot survive alone, I will tell you exactly what I wish someone had told me before Selnari's shaking hands found that old, sealed channel in the wreckage of a collapsing communication core. There is a place in the dark that most of the galaxy has agreed never to call. The warnings about it are not entirely wrong, but they are not entirely right either, and the difference between those two things might be the exact distance between losing everything and finding help from the last place you ever expected to look. Choose carefully, but do not let old fear stop you from choosing at all, when the alternative is losing everything you were ever afraid to risk in the first place. My world is still here because two frightened people refused to accept a silence that felt like the end of everything. I do not know what your choice will be, if the moment ever comes for you the way it came for us. I only know that when we called into the dark, honestly and completely, the dark did not answer with more silence. It answered with everything Earth had left to give. And for us, that was exactly enough.